Hello there again. This is Nate Gable, Farm Management Instructor here at Northeast Iowa Community College. And we were talking at the previous video about the sources of loan funds, and I explained these sources of loan funds: the commercial banks, the farm credit system, life insurance companies, farm service agency, individuals and suppliers, small business administration. So I'm not going to go read all those again because we did already go through those. We left off on this figure right here, figure 19-5. That is the market share of U.S. farm debt. Interestingly enough, about 51% of the U.S. farm debt is with the Farm Credit Services, or the Farm Credit System, like Farm Credit Services. Um, so the Farm Credit System is just over half at 51%. Commercial banks would be a second at 35%. That would be your local bank that you drive by every day, or maybe you have a deposit in that bank. I hope so. Life insurance companies at 7%, other individuals 4%. That would be financed through the seller, possibly. If you heard of people buying farms on contract, that would be fit into this category, where the person that sells the farm actually holds the contract of the farm, and the purchaser, instead of paying for the whole farm at one time, they pay the individual seller every year instead of the bank. In this way, why would a seller do that? Well, because then they get the not only the purchase price of the farm, but they also collect the interest payment, which can help them out. And there can be some tax advantages to doing that also. Non-real estate loans like livestock, machinery, buildings, the farm credit system and the commercial bank swap there. Commercial banks are about 50%, 49%, farm credit system down to 34%. So how do we a develop a good credit? You've heard of credit scores. How do we develop that? How do we develop a credit, good line of credit? Well, first of all, personal character is really important. You know, this shouldn't be rocket science, folks. Who would you want to loan money to? Who would you want to loan money to? Okay, to establish a good credit score, you have think about it. You be the person that you would want to loan money to. Person of high personal character, person who keeps a job, is is a person that pays back their loans, who's out of who is not in legal trouble, a person who says what they're going to do and does it. Pretty important. Management ability, the ability to make good decisions. Are you borrowing money for an item that's going to help the farm, that has the ability to pay itself off, to generate income to pay back the loan? Pretty important. The financial position. Yeah, nobody wants to loan money to a business that's in a poor financial position, that's already buried in debt or losing money constantly. So financial position is very important. Repayment capacity. Does do you have the ability to make the loan payment every year? It doesn't matter if the loan is for a piece of property that was bought at a good deal. If we can't make the payment, it doesn't really matter. So making the payment's really important. The purpose of the loan. Are you buying machinery, land, livestock? Or are we buying a Harley Davidson motorcycle? Which I think is great. That's fun. But it's not something that's going to pay us back. A loan on an asset that's generating income always has a greater chance of being successful versus one that's just for pleasure or fun. And then, of course, having collateral is always a good idea. Collateral, like I said before, is an asset that you're going to put up toward the loan, and we're going to sign over that in the event that if we don't make the payment, the bank can go ahead and take possession of our asset to pay back the loan. Liquidity. is really important when we're determining ability to borrow money. Factors that affect liquidity are business growth, non-business income and expenses. Okay, that's personal spending. Then are we taking a lot of expensive vacations? Are we buying things that don't have a lot of value? Loan characteristics also have a impact on liquidity. What are the annual payments? What's our interest rate, etc. Then our debt structure has an effect on liquidity. How much of our total debt is due in upcoming years? Okay, our financial contingency plan. This is our plan in case things don't go well. We maintain savings or stored crops and livestock that can easily be turned into cash. Maybe that's a good plan. Maintain a credit reserve, or in other words, ability to borrow from a second party or third party in case the first party demands their money back or calls our loan. We prepay debt to lower our total debt when possible. We reduce non-farm expenditures or increase non-farm earnings when needed. Off-farm job can be helpful. Okay, keeping or reducing our non-farm expenditures is always helpful. So reducing the amount of money that we're spending on things that we want versus things we need for the farm. Carrying adequate insurance in case we have a natural disaster, crop failure, or a fire burns down one of our buildings, things like this. Obviously, life and health insurance are very important to cover us in the event that we have a loss or negative impact on our personal well-being. We can sell off less productive assets to raise money, get help from relatives or friends in an emergency, and declare bankruptcy and work out repayments in the absolute worst case scenario. Solvency refers to the amount of debt relative to equity capital. This is the debt to asset ratio that we've talked about back in farm business management class when we looked at the balance sheet. Debt to asset ratio refers to the total amount of debt relative to total amount of assets. Obviously, the lower the total debt to asset ratio, the less debt we have in relation to total amount of assets. Typically, the lower the debt to asset ratio, the lower the risk we are on the farm, lower the risk our farming operation is to a bank. In other words, the better the ability we are going to have to borrow money if we have a lower debt to asset ratio. The maximum safe debt to asset ratio, if the interest rate on borrowed money is higher than the rate of return on farm assets, then the maximum safe debt to asset ratio is found by dividing return on assets by the interest rate. So what that means, return on assets, it means what's our net farm income relative to the total amount of assets we have on the farm. So we may have a farm that's very big, a lot of assets, but it's not simple. It's very not profitable. Okay, that can be a problem. That especially if we're borrowing, if we're only returning 5% on our money, and we're borrowing money at 8%, that tells us that we're probably not able to make payments, or the interest rate that we're paying isn't justifiable because the asset isn't returning enough to make its payment. The maximum safe debt to asset ratio is one at which the one at which the rate of return on equity equals 0. Okay, so here's an illustration of the principle of increasing leverage. Okay, here's a debt to asset ratio, and you can see that if we have zero borrowed money, and we have in all four of these examples, I have equity of $100,000. Okay, well, if I borrow $0, the total asset availability is only $100,000. If I increase my debt to asset ratio from 0 to 33%, In other words, I borrow $50,000. Well, now I can have total assets of $150,000. If I increase my debt to asset ratio to 50%, my borrowed capital begins or becomes exactly equal to my equity capital. So my total assets increase from 100,000 to 200,000. But obviously what's happened to my amount of liability? It's gone up to 100,000. Okay, if we increase our debt to asset ratio to 0.67, that would be a debt of $200,000, a total asset of $300,000. So, okay, let's say we have a good year and our return on assets is 15%. You can see how much money we made. This is our profit. If we didn't have any money borrowed and we have a rate of return on assets of 15%, we only made $15,000. Let's go to the other end of the spectrum. If we'd have a debt to asset ratio of 45%, excuse me, of 0.67 or 67%, we would have a net income of $45,000. Okay, if we paid $220,000 of interest, then our rate of return or our return on equity is a total of $25,000. Now here's the bad scenario, or a poor year. If we only have a rate of return on assets of 5%, if we have no money borrowed, made $5,000. If we have 33% debt to asset ratio or $50,000 borrowed, we actually made $2,500. At 50% debt to asset ratio, we would make nothing, and at 67%, we made a negative $5,000. Inflation and capital gains. Inflation, defined what inflation is the cost of items going up. The cost of machinery, seed, fertilizer, land, insurance, everything else. When inflation is high, investors may prefer to hold tangible assets such as land. When farmers invest in intermediate or long-term assets, solvency and growth in market value equity are closely tied to changes in the values of these capital assets. So yeah, absolutely. When farmers own a lot of land, they are tied, or their net worth gain is closely tied to the value of the land. Equity may rise in periods of rising land prices. However, changes in asset values alone have little effect on liquidity or cash flow unless the assets are sold. So in summary, capital includes cash and money invested into assets. Today's farmers must be skilled in acquiring and using capital. Loans are available from many sources, and there are many alternative repayment plans. Loans affect liquidity and solvency. So I hope this was of interest to you and that you found it useful. As always, if you have any questions or concerns, please feel free to give me a call, stop by my office, or shoot me an email. I'll do my very best to help you out. So with that, have a great day.